Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. My name is Catherine Clayton. I'm Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of Asian Studies at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. And I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar. The title of today's session is The Years That Changed My Life, The Lasting Value of Overseas Public Service Experience. Our four panelists will be discussing how post-college public service opportunities such as the Peace Corps, AmeriCorps, the JET program, and the Jesuit Volunteer Corps can be a great first step into Asia and Pacific Islands related careers. This webinar is part of our CAPA, Careers in Asia Pacific Affairs series, an initiative by the UH Manoa School of Pacific and Asian Studies that is aimed at preparing students for careers in or dealing with Asia and the Pacific Islands. The CAPA initiative is supported by Title VI funding from the federal government. And the funding goes to UH Manoa's 3 national resource centers in Southeast Asian Studies, East Asian Studies, and Pacific Island Studies. It's also, the CAPA initiative is also co-sponsored by the Center for Indo-Pacific Affairs and the Departments of Asian Studies and Pacific Island Studies. So it's really a cross-unit kind of cross-departmental initiative. The goals of the CAPA initiative are 3. The first is to expand students' awareness of the diverse and dynamic careers available across interdisciplinary and specialist fields in Asian and Pacific Island studies. The second goal is to equip students with the knowledge and skills required for jobs in the Asia-Pacific region, including in government, academia, business, and the nonprofit sectors. The third goal is to support the development of workplace competencies required in job markets across different industries and geographies. So in addition to CAPA, today's panel is also co-sponsored by the UH Manoa Matsunaga Institute for Peace, which partners with the Peace Corps to offer a Peace Corps Prep certificate program. This program combines academic coursework, hands-on experience, intercultural skills, and leadership development to enable students to be strong candidates for the Peace Corps service area that fits their skills and interests. More information about the Peace Corps Prep program is available on this website that I've just linked to, that I've just shown on the screen, the website of the Matsunaga Institute for Peace. And there is the link in big letters there so you can see it. So it is now my great pleasure to introduce our moderator for today, Elizabeth Yen-Tzu Liew. Liz is an East-West Center graduate degree fellow and a second-year master's student in the Department of Asian Studies. Over the last 20 years, she has volunteered across Asia and the Pacific in different capacities. She taught at a school for stateless children in East Malaysia, helped NGOs in New Zealand with writing and PR-related activities, and more recently utilized her grant writing skills for a Tibetan non-governmental organization in India, for which she secured $32,000 of grant funding for their language program for Tibetan and Bhutanese refugees studying English and French in preparation for their resettlement. Liz will introduce today's speakers and get us started with the discussion. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A function. And we would be happy to, if you can just type your question into the Q&A and we can read them out as we go. Take it away, Liz.
Thank you, Professor Clayton, for the kind introduction. Let's get to know our panelists this afternoon. So we'll start with Dr. Jim Diegel. He's a hospital and health system senior executive, and he served in the Marshall Islands, Washington State, Oregon, California, DC, as well as Hawaii. He's been a resident of Maui for the last 5 years and holds a bachelor's in the physical sciences biochemistry, a master's in health administration, service administration, and a PhD in public health. Jim served in the U.S. Peace Corps from 1982 to 1985, lived and worked as a community development specialist with an indigenous mountain people on the island of Mindoro in the Philippines. And we have Dr. Andrea Hazzard. She's the inaugural director of Manoa Academic Advising. Dr. Hazzard is a first-generation college student and second-generation Guyanese American. She holds a bachelor's degree in psychology with a minor in medical anthropology and a pre-med concentration from Case Western Reserve University, a master's degree in second language studies from UH Manoa, and a PhD in developmental education from Sam Houston State. She's interested in social justice and cultural diversity. Dr. Hazzard served as a Jesuit volunteer for 3 years after college, working with Indigenous youth in a group home in Alaska and teaching high school in the Marshall Islands. And then we also have Dr. Foley Pfalzgraf. She's the outreach director at the Center for Pacific Island Studies. She holds a bachelor's in international studies from the American University, an MSc in Nature, Society, and Environmental Governance from the University of Oxford, an MA and PhD in Geography and Environment, as well as a certificate in Pacific Island Studies from UH Manoa. She gained the grant writing, management, and evaluation experience through her work as a program specialist for the Hawaii Alliance for Community-Based Economic Development. And before working as staff in HA Hackbed, I think that's the acronym, she completed 2 years of service as AmeriCorps Vista member in Honolulu. And last but not least, we have Kelsey. So Kelsey is a UH Manoa graduate. She spent 4 years, hi Kelsey, in Japan on the JET program. So she'll be talking a bit about that today. And she served as an assistant language teacher and advisor to the Fukuoka Board of Education. She currently serves as co-president and media director of the JET Program Alumni Association of Hawaii, and is a board member of the United Japanese Society of Hawaii and an active participant in the Hawaii Fukuoka Kinjinkai. She's currently the registrar and student info systems manager at her alma mater, Island Pacific Academy. So let's start with our experiences. I was wondering if you guys we'll go around the table. So we'll go around the Zoom room. Maybe tell us a little bit about your overseas experience. You know, tell us the name of your program, where you went, and maybe a little bit about what you did during your time there, and perhaps share one memorable or fun or challenging experience. So whoever wants to start.
You should probably call on somebody. Let's start with Jim.
Let's go, Jim.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today, and good afternoon to all the distinguished panelists as well. We all share, I think, a love and an interest in working overseas, volunteering overseas, and doing great things. So I am the kapuna of the group. I'm a resident here of Maui, spent about 35 years as a senior hospital and health system executive, 25 years of which was in a position as a chief executive officer. So I served in the Philippines in the Peace Corps from 1982 to 1985. I was in a program called Upland Community Development and lived with an indigenous mountain people called the Hanano'o on the island of Mindoro. I lived in a village of about 9 to 10 families located about a 3-hour walk from the nearest road. So just imagine taking a long hike into the Ko'olaus or other mountainous region, and after about 3 hours, you arrive at your site on the edge of a rainforest. And as a Peace Corps volunteer, I got, during my staging, once I was in the Philippines, I had about 2 weeks of very, very basic language, the Hanano'o language, just enough to basically ask, where am I and where am I going type of thing in that. But again, lived in a very isolated region with an indigenous people, elevated thatched roof house with bark walls and bamboo slot floors. They were Swinton agriculturalists, meaning they would cut down the side of the forest and plant all of their food. And they were also hunters and gatherers. So during the hungry season, which lasted about 4 of the 12 months each year, we would forage through the forest and eat all kinds of interesting things. I lived with an old man and an old woman. The old man was Bapa Wyack. He was the medicinal healer and the equivalent of a kahuna for the tribe across several villages, and his wife, Bai Inoi. It was a very egalitarian community, so the women were the adjudicators of conflict. Imagine that. And so the Hanano'omangian had very little long-lasting conflicts because the women would just nip that stuff in the bud along those lines. It was a unique experience because I had to learn the language by total immersion. Basically, no one spoke English in the community, and I worked on 4 projects. One was introducing some agricultural intercropping methods in their Kaingen, their slash and burn field on the side of a mountain. We did some basic health training, also assisted with some indigenous land rights activities. But I think the big project that was everlasting for me is we actually built a 2-room school in the village. We built the school from resources in the forest. So we would cut trees down, saw the lumber, and except for some GI metal sheeting roof and some nails, everything was used from the forest to build the schools. It was the first school of its kind in the Philippines where teachers were also indigenous members of other groups throughout the Philippines. This was the first school in the mountains of Mindoro. And it just was a very, very unique collaborative project with the International Ford Foundation, Foster Parents Plan, the municipal government, the Department of Education, and some other funders out there. That school still operates today. In fact, there's now electricity into my site. This has been 40 years, and they have a Facebook page. So it has been fun to kind of reconnect and see that a project that I started is still going. I think one of the major challenges I had when I was in my site was just the isolation, right? The nearest village from my village was about an hour-and-a-half walk. And again, the nearest road was about 3 hours away. And so sometimes isolation would set in. I think one of the other unique things that happened to me in Peace Corps is I became conversant in 4 Filipino languages. So you can speak with me in Tagalog or Hiligaynon or Mangyan or Bicol, and I'll be able to carry on a conversation with you. I had one unique story to tell. And I used to spend a lot of time with Papa Wyack, the old man, because he would teach me about the culture and everything like that. We were walking one time on a path, and we came upon and startled a wild boar, and they're called talon baboy in Filipino. And this wild boar was not happy that we had surprised it on the trail, and it turned, and the hair on the back of its neck went up, and it had big incisors upper and lower, and it was chomping and being very territorial. And Bapa, just being this unique kahuna-like person, just told me to stay behind him, and he started a conversation with this wild boar. And before I knew it, the 20 feet that separated us from the boar, Bapa had moved up to this boar, and this pig had settled down, went down on its haunches, laid on its side. He was talking to it, scratched its belly. It closed its eyes. It took a nap. And then, eventually he said, well, we have to go our way, and so do you. And the boar opened its eyes, stood up. Papa stepped back, it wagged its tail, off it went into the forest. And I've just never seen anything like that in my life. And that was just the uniqueness of this old man who was a leader in the community and in the area, and a spiritual man in and of himself. And I saw all kinds of things like that over and over and over with Papa and other Hmong elders. So that kind of describes my experience. Peace Corps experience was in the mountains, almost just shy of 3 years before we went back to the West Coast.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing that, Jim. Maybe Andrea, you want to go next?
Sure. So when I was in undergrad, I was pre-med, and I knew I wanted to volunteer after college. I felt really strongly that that was going to be an important part of my formation and the experience I wanted to have. However, when I looked at Peace Corps, I was like, oh, 2 years, that's too long. I want to go to medical school 1 year. 1 year is what I want. And so I started exploring alternatives to Peace Corps and found Jesuit Volunteer Corps. What I liked about them is that, and we may have a slide that we might be able to show you, but what I liked about them were the 4 precepts on which they're founded, which is living in community, social justice, spirituality, and living simply. And so that for me felt like the type of a program that I wanted and the type of an experience I wanted. And so because I only wanted a 1-year program, I actually started out with their domestic program on the island of Sitka in Alaska. And I worked with Indigenous youth in a group home setting. And you might remember that I was pre-med as an undergrad psychology major. And I thought, you know, this will be great. I can kind of get a sense of how psychology is used with adolescents, which was an area of interest. At the time, I was also playing around with, well, maybe I might go to graduate school instead. I'm not sure. So this will help me make that decision. And so here I was working at this group home, and one of our young people decided to run away, and he happens to be one of the rare people of color like myself who's not of Alaska Indigenous heritage, but another group. And I said to him, where are you going to go? People know us, you know, when you're brown and you're not of that place, that people love to tell me, oh, I saw you walking here today. I saw you walking there, you know, when you live in a small island community. But what I noticed, and the job that I had in the group home, was really being the educational advocate for the students at the schools, because for many of them, their parents might have been incarcerated or they had been given up to the state for various reasons. And when I would take them to their counseling appointments, the counselors had 1 day a week with them, but it was the teachers who had them every day. And I thought to myself, this is really interesting because the students present one way for counseling, but the teachers are the ones who saw them on a daily basis. And for some reason that started to really appeal to me, this idea of relationship building in a more constant way. And at the time, I wasn't in any relationships. I'm young, I'm single. I thought, you know, maybe it's time to go overseas. If I'm going to do it, this is the perfect time to do it. So I applied to the international program and was intrigued by teaching. And so requested Jamaica and Nepal for cultural and heritage reasons in terms of who I am. And they said to me, Marshall Islands. Back in the day, I'm old enough. So 1992 to 93 was when I was in Alaska. 1993 to 95 is when I was in the Marshall Islands. Internet was just kind of coming to be in the world. And so I would tell people, if you open up a world atlas, the Marshall Islands is where the 2 pages meet in the middle. And so I knew nothing about it, but I felt very open to the experience. I thought, if that's where I'm needed, that's where I'll go. So I was asked to teach high school. Because of my background as a pre-med student, I taught biology, chemistry, physics, earth science, and English, all at the same time. And so it was really great. But what I discovered was a love of teaching and my very firm belief that teaching is the most beautiful mix of science and art. And so for me, that ignited my passion in teaching. I became very interested in how do we teach English to speakers of other languages. And it brought me to UH Manoa to do my master's in second language studies. And so, you know, that for me was a really big moment of formation in terms of my path. I would say in terms of memorable and challenging experiences, in Alaska, it would be walking through the park, but making sure you made enough noise so that if there were any bears, you know, trying to look for salmon in the river, you kind of alerted them that you were present. And I would say that in the Marshall Islands, just the unique opportunity to live on an island that was 1 mile long, 200 yards wide, 16,000 people, and it's your world. And you think nothing of it in terms of being able to see ocean and lagoon right there, and meeting what I would like biasly say are the most wonderful people in the world, and really being taken in and taken care of, and the opportunity to learn another language, learn another culture, and really have your Americanness situated from a global perspective. And that really is something I've taken with me through the years. Thank you.
Thanks so much for sharing, Andrea. So from voice to viz to isolation to languages, what interesting experiences. Shall we go with Kelsey? Share your experience, Kelsey.
Hi, everybody. My name is Kelsey. I am currently the co-president and media director of the JET Program Alumni Association of Hawaii. But when I first really thought about applying for the JET program, I wasn't completely invested in specifically going to Japan. I knew that I had a connection, just like from personal backgrounds, to Japan. But no one in my family really spoke Japanese. I did grow up with some of the cultural, kind of things that are in Hawaii, but I still didn't have a way to fully connect with the culture and with the people. So I did apply for the JET program, and I was very lucky to be chosen to be a participant. And through that JET program, the JET program, JET stands for Japan Exchange and Teaching Program. I really got to find ways to connect with local people and really build connections. I think, like Jim and Andrea have said already too, building the connections with the local community is something that is probably my biggest takeaway. I learned how to work with, my co-teachers as well as with my supervisors. But even more so, I learned how to get to know them as people. And that's really when those connections kind of stick. So that was my introduction to kind of learning about appreciating kind of cross-cultural experiences and those kinds of things. Yeah, once I came back from the JET program, I started to work at my alma mater. And aside from being the registrar at the school, I still wanted to find that connection with the students. When I was in Japan, I was serving as like an advisor in my last 2 years. So in that way, it kind of taught me different ways to be a teacher. Being a teacher doesn't necessarily have to be, just in the classroom setting. But being a teacher for students at sporting events or sports clubs, things like that. So I also serve as the volleyball assistant coach for my school. So I find different ways to appreciate and connect with the students. So yeah, that's pretty much it. Yeah, I just learned to find ways to appreciate and respect teaching in different ways.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Kelsey. And I know we can talk a bit more about the JET program in the coming questions. Maybe Foley, over to you to share a little bit about your experience, your program.
Sure, thank you, Liz, and thanks, Kathy, for bringing us together. And it's nice to be on a panel with you folks who are amazing. So I am an alumni of AmeriCorps Vista, which is, we like to say, the domestic Peace Corps. So it's not overseas in a foreign sense, but I did travel over water to participate in AmeriCorps. And there's a bunch of different AmeriCorps programs. So Vista is Volunteers in Service to America, and that program is targeted more specifically towards university graduates. And the way I got interested in it was I had just finished my master's degree, and I really felt like I was in an ivory tower. I felt disconnected from doing good. Like I just spent all this time thinking really hard, and I wanted to like do something more practical and more sort of positive in the world beyond writing papers. And so I ended up applying for both AmeriCorps and Peace Corps. And AmeriCorps called me back first, so then I signed up for AmeriCorps. And the way AmeriCorps Vista works is you're placed with a local organization. So I was with the Hawaii Alliance for Community-Based Economic Development, or HACBED, as we call it, because it's a really long name. And HackBet's it was a wonderful organization to work with here in Honolulu because they have really strong roots. And the organization was founded in the 80s and early 90s when there was a lot of resistance to tourism as the primary industry in Hawaii. And some of the folks started kind of trying to imagine what would an alternative pathway look like. And that's where we got to community-based economic development. And so while I was at HackBet, I had a really incredible opportunity to meet and spend time with folks who really had a vision for Hawaii that was more grounded in community and maybe more grounded in Aina. So I worked with a lot of Aina-based organizations, and a lot of the work that I did was helping with grants, helping with reporting, helping with meetings, taking notes, summarizing next steps, sometimes helping with strategic planning, those sorts of things. So it was a really valuable experience to kind of understand after university, like how does work happen? I had always had jobs, but I hadn't had to take leadership before. So that was a really wonderful opportunity for me. And it was challenging too at times. And just one memorable or challenging experience was during the time that I was at AmeriCorps Vista, I was working with Hawaii County on their financial empowerment program. And during that time was when the Puna lava flow happened, where 700 structures were buried under lava. And so the county and FEMA and all the service organizations came together to work towards meeting people's needs in the short term after losing their homes and facing like really serious disruption and trauma. And I was able to be part of a team that was writing some grants to support the provision of additional resources for folks who might not be eligible for FEMA, like maybe their house wasn't permitted, maybe they didn't have the capacity to apply for FEMA resources. And so through the Financial Empowerment Center program, we were able to provide more resources to community members who were impacted by the lava flow. Thank you.
That's so incredible, Foley. I really like the story about leadership. I think, you know, a lot of our students will be able to resonate with that. So just kind of on that, I think I was going to ask you to expand. So a lot of students and just young people I talk to, they're very hesitant to take a gap year, and they're just really afraid of what it might look like on their CV. Like, you know, would it look like I'm a bum, you know, and they're always pressured to get a job. So when I took a gap year, I know there were lots of questions, but I learned so much in that year, you know, improvise, communication, how to work, to resolve problems with very little resources. And it sounds like you also talked a bit about that. So perhaps just as your role as the outreach director at the Center for Pacific Studies, I was just wondering maybe you could talk a bit about specifically the kind of skills or maybe perspective that you picked up in your time in AmeriCorps and how that's enabled you to achieve your current position.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you've really drawn out like a very clear line in my experience, and I agree completely. I would never have gotten the job that I have right now, which is a faculty member at a university, which is, you know, like that was my dream when I was a kid, and it's harder and harder for accessing those types of roles because it's just really competitive, and there's fewer now than there might have been in the past. But I think one of the primary ways that I was able to get my job was through my experience in grant writing. And as an AmeriCorps Vista, one of my main duties was to work with community-based orgs and write grants. So when I was a GA, I helped with the National Resource Center for Pacific Islands grant, and then the full position went up, and I thought I possibly wasn't qualified. And then I was encouraged to apply, and I did, and I happened to get it. And I think I really credit my experience in grant writing, and then also just program management. It's those kind of soft skills that you get too, of like follow-ups, making sure you're able to communicate effectively, being able to work well in teams and independently. And those are all skills that I like thought I had before AmeriCorps. And then I remember I would be like out on a farm somewhere, and I'd be like at a meeting, but it was actually more of a pauhana, and I'd be trying to navigate like how to be effective at my job when I didn't always know like where work ended and where conversation began and those sorts of things. So I feel like the the competence to be able to navigate those situations and be able to like work with communities at the same time as being able to work with institutions was really impactful. And I think I do that every day in my job now too.
Yeah, the theme of leadership and teamwork, I think, is a big theme these days. And it just maybe gets harder, gets easier if we're online. Maybe Jim and Andrea, like if you guys, maybe Jim, you wanted to share a little bit about sort of like skills that you picked up in your time as a volunteer. Sure. And how that's helped to shape your career and where you are currently, maybe trajectory of a career also.
Okay. Just so that everyone knows, I'm no longer a practicing leader per se in hospitals and health systems. So I'm in this quasi-retired state, but I also consult and advise for 2 health science universities on the mainland. So I've kind of, I'm kind of moving into the retirement phase. But I mentioned I had a 35-year career, and that included working in a rural environment, suburban environment, urban environment, international environment in the Marshall Islands. Andrea and I share a very unique thing, shows you how small the world is. We both worked on the same island in the Marshall Islands. She followed me about 2 years after I completed some work there. So the Pacific is a big place, but it's really, really small in many respects. But I've worked in not-for-profit, academia, governmental organizations. I've worked with populations where I served with Native American, Pacific Islanders, worked at a historical Black college and university in Washington, D.C., Howard University, the alma mater of presidential candidate Kamala Harris, and I'll stop right there. But some of the skills that I learned in Peace Corps in that really were the ability to be self-sufficient in many respects, to have courage to do things that I thought maybe I didn't have the experience to do, understanding culture and languages, and how then all of that led to really meeting people where they are, learning to adapt to different cultures and communities, organizational cultures, this whole concept of service to others, really spending a lot of time in the here and now versus always thinking 5-10 years out, I think kept me very, very grounded. And also this commitment to social justice is kind of been really, really key throughout my career over the years. And those skills really gave me a lens through which I ultimately could lead organizations and people, which I did for a clear majority of my career. And, we talked about taking a gap, a year or 2 or 3. It did not negatively impact me because after I came back from Peace Corps, started my family, went to graduate school, but because of my unique background and especially the Peace Corps experience, I ended up being a CEO at the age of 30, which is somewhat atypical in the traditional milieu of hospitals and health systems. Granted, it was a rural hospital, but all of those skills and that background opened doors for me that probably would not have, been open. So I really advocate for any young person to take a year or 2 or 3 in your 20s and volunteer or explore and be of service to others, because I'm in my mid-60s now, and let me tell you, 2 or 3 years in your 20s is nothing when you get to my age. And when you look back on that, you're so thankful that you did take the time to learn about others and learn about yourself. So I think whatever volunteer experience you choose in service, it only deepens and adds to who you are as an individual, and it opens all kinds of doors.
I love that, Jim. Those are such wise nuggets. 2 or 3 years, in your 20s is really nothing, because when you look back, it really shapes and almost sets the path to your entire career. And when you talked about empathy, I think it's an underrated trait. It's so powerful, right? Empathy and perspective. And it's been talked about these days as one of the top key leadership traits that we see with, in top leadership. So thank you for sharing that. Maybe Andrea, you want to share a little bit before we bounce to more about JET?
Yeah, sure. So I would say that within the context of education, teaching in a country where resources are limited in many ways, and families live in very small quarters, multiple family units, it made me very aware of our students' life circumstances, and that we need to think about that as educators, that we can't make assumptions about that they have a place to do homework, and that they have power at night. And so when you really get down to the nitty-gritty of life, it just was a good reminder. Growing up, I grew up in the Bronx in New York, and to this day, when I think back to when I was in Alaska and hearing stories about the Marshall Islands, and I'm like, I don't know if I can do that. I don't know if I can do that. And next thing I know, I'm doing that. And so I think in that sense, that sense of development for me, like I've lived an urban life. I've also lived the most rural life. I've lived on outer islands where there's no running water or electricity as well. And to realize my own capacity of what I can do, I think that was so, I remind myself of that. Like when there's hard things that come up, I'm like, I can do this because I have this rich, wonderful past, thanks to the places I've been part of. I would say too that, right now, this is my first position as an administrator in higher ed. I was faculty for 30 some years, always trying to make impact where I could. And the reason I went into administration is when you start to realize about systemic oppression and systems that have barriers, even in education, there comes a point from a social justice perspective where you want to figure out where can you help make the most change. And I think for me, that really became a calling, if you will, that it's time to step into administration for me, because I've done as much as I can as faculty, at least for my own personal growth. And I thought, if I want to impact at this other level, I think this is how I need to do it. And so to serve this inaugural position, it's an amazing thing. And I think when I look at my past, I think I have this position in part because of the educational journey I've had working with students, understanding background, always advocating that we do a holistic approach to education, taking into account student characteristics. And so to that end, I really bring social justice with me as an administrator, and how I look at our system of education. One of the areas I try to impact is our pathway from our community colleges and transfer into Manoa. And so, really thinking about the whole picture of our students and the challenges they may have. From a theoretical perspective, a lot of my work is informed by universal design, the idea that if we plan and if we set policies and practices for those most in need, we're probably doing right by all of our students. And so again, all of that really for me started with a seed of being in a program that allowed us to talk about justice and oppression. And I think that's what I really found formative about my program, and that the living in community aspect, we had dinner conversations about it, right? Why does this circumstance exist, and what role do we play? One of the ethos I liked about the Jesuit Volunteer Corps is we're trying to work ourselves out of a job, because ideally we wanted those positions to be filled by local people. And so there is that tension, if you will, of what does it mean to be a volunteer, but then to be part of an organization that's very aware, and thinking about that was really impactful for me as well. And so positionality is still something I think I've taken with me. Thanks.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I feel like I need to kind of frame these little nuggets. You talking about teaching in a place where there's so limited resources, and then just flipping that perspective of understanding not all students have access to the same kind of things that we take for granted, like light, right? Like reading probably by the street lights. And systemic oppression, like where you can make the most change. I think a lot of youth are really interested, but they don't know how. So I think that's some really, really great nuggets. of wisdom there. Thank you so much for sharing. Maybe we can dive into a little bit about JET. Kelsey, did you want to share a little bit more about the JET program and maybe talk about what the requirements are? I have a few students in my 310 class. They are really interested. If you could share more about that, being an alumni as well, maybe you could be a point of contact for them.
Yeah, absolutely. If they need somebody to contact, please feel free to have them reach out to me. I'm more than happy to talk about JET anytime. Well, I do want to bring up one thing. I do really appreciate, Andrea, how you brought up like you changing your perspective about what I can do, and not limiting yourself. That's definitely something really important to me. Just, I feel like before my perspective of what my career pathway was going to be was very straight. I planned to just kind of stay in education, my whole time, but JET really helped to change my trajectory a little bit in terms of how I wanted to interact with the education field. So for the JET program, a lot of people in Hawaii do know JET. I think now there's something about 80,000 JET alumni all over the world in more than 18 to, I think now there's 40 countries that are involved. Whether it's, the United States, the United Kingdom, there are even JETs from Trinidad and Tobago, Jamaica, the Philippines, and one of the biggest things is you really get to meet people from all over the world, not just interacting with people from Japan, but really gaining a good global perspective of many different cultures. But yeah, so for the JET program, like I said, it stands for the Japan Exchange and Teaching Program. A lot of people focus more toward the kind of teaching perspective of what JET means, but it's so much more than just the straightforward teaching in classrooms. For me, I was lucky to be in two kind of positions when I was with the JET program. I started out my first 2 years as an assistant language teacher, and I taught at more than 18 schools within the prefecture, which means that I taught roughly about, I would say, 20,000 students in my 2 years that I was there, which is insane to think about in some ways that I, had a chance to interact with that many students. And when I first went there, my perspective of that was, I won't really be able to connect with 20,000 people in just 2 years' time. But I really learned to appreciate my connections, not only with the students, but with the teachers that I worked with too. And it taught me ways to kind of get to know my students and my teachers quickly, and how to make those lasting bonds with them. And in my following 2 years, I was on the JET program for 4 years total. My last 2 years, I spent it as the prefectural advisor, and that was kind of a more advisory position for new JETs coming into the teaching position. Where I got to share my experiences. And of course, that 18 schools thing was not very common amongst everyone, but I think I could share my perspective about how to create those lasting relationships with my teachers and students with them. And in that position, I kind of helped to plan monthly meetings for about 125 people each time. And this was to help them learn different ways to teach the students. And of course, going in and only being on that program for 2 years, I'm definitely nothing close to being an expert, but it really taught me to appreciate coming together and learning the best technique for our students as a team. So yeah, that was kind of my JET experience. I lived very urban. I was not in the mountains like Jim. And I think I saw maybe one boar in my time when I was in Japan. But I think being in the city, being in a country that, doesn't have a lot of English in terms of like, they do learn some English, I would say like by textbook, but not so many in terms of interaction. It was its own kind of beast in a way. You get to really find ways to connect with people, even if the language is not there. But the JET program, it is a yearly program. You can renew up to 5 years for a total of, a 5-year time in Japan. You can select kind of put down a hopeful prefecture that you wish to go to. It's not always guaranteed, but I think, just being in Japan itself is a very unique opportunity. And don't be afraid to experience kind of the countryside of Japan. There's so many unique charms to it as well.
That's quite amazing, Kelsey. 20,000 students in 2 years. I just had a quick question about the requirements in terms of language proficiency. Can you tell us what level they need to be in order to apply for
Sure,
the
of
program?
course. Sorry, I didn't bring that up. The requirements for JET is that you have to have a 4 years bachelor degree completed by the time you go on the program. So you are more than welcome to apply for the JET program kind of in your senior year, your last year of college, when you're starting to think about new positions to start up once you're finished. There is actually no language requirement for learning Japanese or knowing Japanese, sorry. But there's a lot of opportunities while you're on JET to take advantage of learning the language. You also have opportunities to kind of get funding to take different kinds of things like TESOL or TESOL, different programs, so that you can finish the program coming out even stronger in terms of resume and having that under your belt.
Really nice perks to have. Is there a stipend the students wanted to know?
Yes, there is a stipend for this program. I feel roughly compared to what we know as like the American kind of salary, it's a little bit less. However, the cost of living in Japan is a lot cheaper. My apartment, I had 3 rooms and a large living room, and I paid $250 a month. So the cost of living, in comparison to the salary, it is very, very reasonable. So please don't let that, kind of stop you from applying yourself for that program.
That's really heartening to hear. I will let one of them know. She was very interested when we first spoke in the beginning of the semester. And I'll definitely refer her to you if that's okay.
Thank you. Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah, thanks for sharing about the JIT program. Maybe we could continue on this thread in terms of if the students are interested in pursuing these opportunities, thinking about what they need to prepare themselves. Like, I know Kelsey talked a bit about, you can go in with a bachelor's degree, senior year, you don't need to speak Japanese. Maybe Foley, you want to talk a bit more about your experience in terms of preparation for your AmeriCorps program?
Sure. So since AmeriCorps is kind of broad, there's Vista, which is targeted more towards college graduates. But you don't always have to have a degree to apply. And then there's AmeriCorps NCCC. And then there's also FEMA Corps. So there's actually quite a big spectrum, and they all have different requirements. But for AmeriCorps Vista, you have to be over 18. You have to be a permanent resident, U.S. citizen, or a U.S. national, or someone with asylum status or DACA works as well. And then the application's actually pretty easy. So if you're kind of thinking about it, I would just say go for it, because it's not a super involved process. For example, I know Peace Corps is like a little bit more complex of a process, and I'm sure Jim will get to speak about that. But for AmeriCorps, you go into the portal and you create a profile. So it's kind of like online dating in a sense, where you have this profile and you can send it to up to 20 different sites or jobs. And so then you kind of put it out there, and then the sites are able to view your application. And if they think that you'd be a good fit, then you can get an email from them, do an interview. So it's actually a pretty straightforward process. The only thing that takes a little bit of time to put together is you need 2 references. And when I was with AmeriCorps, after I finished my service, I was hired by my organization. So then I spent some time like recruiting AmeriCorps members. And one of the things that we really do look at are those letters. And so having folks who can speak about your leadership qualities, your commitment to social justice. We had everyone from, maybe your church leader to one of your professors to a mentor at a volunteer organization that you've worked with. I would really encourage folks to think about who would make a good reference and who could speak to your qualities. because I think that's one of the ways that you can really set yourself apart and be competitive for these positions. And also there's positions nationally as well as in Guam and Puerto Rico and Saipan and some other places. So there's a real like opportunity to go to a new place, and there's always more being posted. There's no hard deadline. It's rolling. So you can always go to the website and check out kind of what's up and see if there's anything that's a good fit.
Thanks, Foley. I think that's a really good tip. You know, when you think about your referees, like your references, and you need to also be able to draft letters for them and not just expect them to have time to write these letters for you. So that's a really good tip. Jim, did you want to share a little bit about preparation?
Sure. Yeah. So the Peace Corps of today is a little bit different than the Peace Corps of 40 years ago. So when I first joined Peace Corps, you did have to have an undergraduate degree. And for the most part, most of the Peace Corps volunteers were in their 20s. However, Peace Corps these days is really very, very diverse. And so not only do you have younger people, but you also have mid-career adults who want to do something different. And you also have kupuna that are either retired or toward the very end of their career, and they want to have another experience out there. All of the applications for Peace Corps, you can do it online, peacecorps.gov. But the beauty of it for Hawaii now is Peace Corps now has a dedicated Peace Corps recruiter based at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Her name is Shannon. I think she's in the Office of Civic and Community Engagement or something like that. And she also has 2 assistants to help that process, because we're really targeting the state of Hawaii for potential Peace Corps opportunities. If you are a younger person, they really prefer that you have an undergraduate degree or you're on the way to graduate from university, unless you have a very unique skill set. So if you had a 2-year nursing degree as a registered nurse and you wanted to join Peace Corps, they would waive that requirement of an undergraduate degree. If you're a mid-career adult, you don't necessarily have to have an undergraduate degree, especially if you have life experience in a field that Peace Corps is really trying to recruit for. So, for example, I know someone who, from the state of Hawaii a year ago, joined Peace Corps, 42 years of age, not a college graduate, but a successful business person. So they were recruited into Peace Corps to be a small business consultant going forward. And then for kupuna, it's just a whole different skill set that's required. And they just give you credit for life. If you've made it that far, you certainly have skills in that. But the rationale behind an undergraduate degree, especially when you're younger, is just to ensure that you have competencies to contribute when you join Peace Corps. So the application process is online. The Peace Corps recruiter can walk you through that. They usually do have some pretty heavy-duty screening because you are going overseas. So security checks, health checks, legal checks, and all of that. And then sometimes they will have a formal on-site screening process where you go and get evaluated in what's called a Center for Assessment and Skills Training. Or sometimes if your background is unique and robust and you have the appropriate requirements and recommendations, you can kind of move through the process. Peace Corps is a 2-year commitment. You can extend. Years ago, people used to extend and extend and extend and serve sometimes 5-7 years. Usually what they like to see is a 2-year commitment with the possibility of another year extension, but it is not uncommon in Peace Corps. Sometimes people will complete their service and then they'll take another 2-year assignment in another location around the world. So it really just depends on what it is that you want to do. the really unique thing about Peace Corps, and I think with AmeriCorps and with other volunteer service organizations as well, but I know with Peace Corps, there are a lot of scholarships available post-Peace Corps for graduate level training, whether it's at the master's level or the PhD level, et cetera. I know that the Johns Hopkins School of Nursing gives top priority to anybody who's served in Peace Corps and applies to the nursing program. And some of the medical schools are similar to that. So you'll find that, again, going back to this concept of the gap year, that any type of service is actually going to make you very competitive if you choose to advance your education at the graduate level, simply because it's showing initiative and unique experiences. Yep.
Thanks so much, Jim. I always say to people, you know, when I look at applications, job applications, it's not so much the academic qualifications, but how you've been invested and engaged in society. Because, you know, as this all of you have shared, you gain so many skills and knowledge and perspective, and it helps you to shape you to become a much holistic and whole person. I just had a quick question. So you were saying, Jim, about the health checks. They're done before the Peace Corps program? They're correct? And are they paid for by a reimbursement or it's on your own?
No, Peace Corps, especially when you have the medical exam, and that Peace Corps will pay for that. I know that when one of the final conditions, when I was accepted into Peace Corps again 40 years ago, and because of where I was going in the isolation, I had to have a dental exam, and they decided to prophylactically pull my wisdom teeth because they didn't want you to go way out in the middle of nowhere and have your wisdom teeth become impacted, and that was covered by Peace Corps. But it's a general health screening just to make sure you don't have something that maybe you never thought you had or whatever, and you qualify.
Yeah, I think that's really important as well, for especially some of these students are interested, you know, and it also could raise concerns for parents as well if they don't have that kind of funding to cover their health. I think we are almost on time, but I was wondering maybe if there was any last words that anybody else, any of the panelists wanted to share, if you haven't already, in terms of what you feel could be for career development. What would you say has been the lasting value of overseas public service opportunities?
I'll go ahead and I'll share that I think it's almost a domino effect, that one opportunity leads to another opportunity, leads to another opportunity, and they've all been really great ones. And so I think just kind of dipping your toe in the water and getting a sense of what life is like. I mentioned identity and formation. I think I don't think you understand, in my humble opinion for myself, what it means to be from this country until you've lived in another country, especially if you identify with other, whatever groups you identify with. So for me in the United States as a person of color, you know, that's one positionality, but when you're overseas, it's a completely different positionality. And then you start to see what you have more in common with people from your country and from the other country. And I think that's life long lasting. So I would just say that perspective, and then taking it into different careers. So having been able to serve as a teacher trainer with the Ministry of Education, having been able to go over to Antigua and Barbuda in the Caribbean and work at a medical school, having worked back in the Marshall Islands at a community college for a number of years. And then all of that for me, I think, culminated in my ability to get this position. You know, which is an inaugural position for the university. So I think it's a beautiful domino effect of good things for one's career.
Thank you so much, Andrea. And I think your experience brings so much richness into the campus and, you know, to student life as well. Is there anyone who wants to share any last words before we wrap up?
I just wanted to share briefly, sort of building on what Jim mentioned. that AmeriCorps also has benefits that can help you in your career later. So for example, you can be eligible for the Siegel Education Award, which I think this nowadays is around $7,000, that if you complete your year of service, you can use that to pay down your student loans. So I'm still using it to pay student loans, which probably just speaks to how many loans I have rather than my length of service. But you can also use it for qualified educational expenses. So I used mine to buy a laptop for school, which would have been really hard otherwise at that time. And then you also can access non-competitive eligibility, which is great for if you're applying for federal jobs. It kind of like gets your foot in the door, and Peace Corps members are eligible for the same. The salary is not great. So that's one thing to think about, is like what's financially feasible for you. And so there is, at the same time that national service and international service is really incredible, it can be expensive in terms of not being able to make as much money as you might have in other contexts. But I think after listening to all of our panelists today, it really pays dividends in experience, in drive, in giving you an opportunity to think outside of yourself and connect with people. So I just wanted to share that there are benefits, and there are also challenges with like navigating the financial dynamics of service.
Thank you so much, Foley. I think that's a big draw as well. And, as everyone has shared, I think these experiences and opportunities give you skills and perspectives and knowledge that no academy can give you, no matter how many years you stay in school. I think that is the end of our session today, our CAPA talk. Professor Clayton, maybe I can hand over to you for closing.
Sure. Well, I just want to thank all of you for your service, but also for being here today and for sharing these really inspiring and, energizing kinds of experiences. Just so many people that I know in the fields that I work in kind of got their start in that field by doing these kinds of experiences. I taught English for a couple of years in China. This is another, maybe I shouldn't share this story, but I worked for World Teach, which is the program that Tim Waltz was on, and I may have trained him. I'm not sure. I think he was there the year before I was, but we were both in China around the same time. And so anyway, right, these kinds of experiences just keep resonating throughout your life in different ways. I am now, as Foley said, a professor at a university teaching Chinese studies. That probably wouldn't have happened if I hadn't had that experience. So I encourage all of you who are watching to and students to really consider something like this. It's a blast. It's an adventure. And it also really has really lasting impact. So thank you all for your participation today, and best wishes.
Thank you, everyone.